Now, it's also interesting to look at the perspective under which both of these guns were adopted by their militaries. With the Sturmgewehr, the idea was kind of to turn every rifleman into both a rifleman and a light machine gunner. There's a very interesting, I find fascinating, early trials report, a combat report from one of the very first units to get Sturmgewehrs. And what they reported is they had gone from a group, they had 86 men, I believe, in the unit, with, I think, 12 MG42s and the rest of the men armed with Mausers. And they refitted with their new Sturmgewehrs, and they dropped down to 4 MG42s, and everybody else in the unit got an STG, or an MP43 at that point. And they went into combat. They were fighting day in, day out in Russia. And what they found was on the attack, when they're moving forward, they specifically detail an advance of about 100 yards or 100 meters that they conducted onto a Russian position. And what they noted was they never had to stop. The German troops were able to keep moving through the entire attack, all 100 yards, and take the enemy position. Where with their old Mausers, they would have had to stop a couple times to reload because they only had 5 rounds. With a 30-round magazine in this case, it would have been used primarily on semi-automatic, they were able to maintain fire while moving all the way to this objective, which led to far fewer casualties because they were able to get there faster, they were able to keep the enemy's head down more effectively. And then on the retreat, when they had been, if you were retreating under fire in a typical German unit in World War II with Mauser rifles and MG42 or 34 mounted machine guns, the machine guns would cover the riflemen. And then at some point, the machine guns had to pick up and move backwards, relocate to a new position rearward. When they packed up, a substantial, in fact, the majority of the unit's firepower was unavailable, and it left everyone vulnerable. With the Sturmgewehrs, this report specifically mentions that it effectively turned every rifleman into a light machine gunner. There was no vulnerable period during a combat retreat. They were, you can do fire and movement where a couple guys are moving while a couple guys are covering them, and the guys covering have the same firepower capacity as if they had machine guns. So the Germans really saw this as a rifle made more effective in semi-auto, where the Russians, on the other hand, developed the AK as a submachine gun in tactical terms, really. The Russians had transitioned largely to submachine guns at the end of World War II. They had the PPS-43, which was an extremely fast and cheap to manufacture submachine gun, which is actually a far better submachine gun than you would expect just looking at it. And when they developed the 7.62x39 cartridge, they recognized that this was a more powerful cartridge than a pistol round, but they were developing a replacement for the PPS-43. That's what the AK was supposed to do. And in that guise, what it was intended for was close-range combat, primarily in full auto, firing bursts. Full auto was more important than semi-auto on the AK in terms of Soviet doctrine. And the AK does really well at that. Its higher rate of fire is more suited to that. Could it have been a smaller cartridge, more like what the StG used? Sure, it could have been, but they opted not to. And it's interesting that the Soviets had adopted the SKS right at the same time as a new rifle to replace the Mosin Nagant and the SVT. And the SKS, as soon as the stamped receiver AKs were figured out and in production, the SKS was cut off. They were deemed obsolete. They stopped producing them and realized that the AK, which they had developed as a submachine gun concept, really could do everything that the SKS could and would stand in as a rifle. So the two countries came at this approach kind of from opposite directions. The Germans developed a lighter, handier, a rifle with a rifle that had more volume of fire than a bolt action, where the Russians were adopting a submachine gun that had a heavier cartridge than their 9mm or, well, than their 7.62 Tokarev submachine guns. So it's very interesting to consider these two from those two different perspectives. And ultimately, obviously, the AK is, time has proven, the AK is the better of the two guns. But it did also come with the advantage of seeing what the Germans were doing first and improving on those things that needed improvement.